Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong spent decades as comedy's most famous stoners. Two guys who seemed to stumble through a hazy, laid-back world where nothing ever went wrong. But the real story behind that image is stranger, tenser, and far more interesting than the characters they played on screen. Before the gold records and the sold-out tours, there was a draft dodger delivering a rug to a strip club, a failed Motown guitarist trying to save his family's business, and a partnership that was never as easy as it looked. Here's what actually happened. Richard Cheech Marin grew up in South Los Angeles, the son of an LAPD officer. It was a disciplined household, not an artistic one, and by his early 20s Marin wasn't dreaming about comedy at all. He was studying pottery and English at California State University, Northridge. Then the Vietnam War draft caught up with him. Marin opposed the war, and like tens of thousands of other young American men in the late 1960s, he chose to leave rather than fight in it. He crossed into Canada and settled in Vancouver, not looking for adventure, just trying to stay out of a war he didn't believe in. Tommy Chong's path ran in almost the opposite direction. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, to a Chinese father and a Scottish-Irish mother, Chong grew up immersed in music and nightlife rather than politics. By the late 1960s, he'd already had a taste of real success as a guitarist with Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, a Motown signed group that shared stages with acts like the Jackson 5. But the band fell apart. Chong was let go after missing a gig, reportedly because he didn't have a work visa to be in the U.S., and he returned home to Vancouver to figure out his next move. That next move came from an unlikely place, his family's business. Chong's parents had bought a Chinatown venue called the Shanghai Junk, which operated as one of Vancouver's first topless bars. Chong took over its back room and noticed something. The crowd wasn't paying much attention to the dancers between sets. So he started booking a loose improv comedy troupe called City Works to fill the gaps, blending sketch comedy with burlesque in a way almost nobody else was doing at the time. Marin, meanwhile, was just trying to survive as an undocumented draft dodger in a foreign country. As it's often told, the two men actually met when Marin delivered a carpet to the club next door and wandered over to check out what Chong's strange little venue was doing. They hit it off immediately, and Chong invited him to join the troupe. Neither man had any idea that a chance conversation over a rug delivery was about to become the start of one of the most successful comedy partnerships in American history. Nothing about the early days of Cheech and Chong looked like the beginning of a legendary act. The City Works troupe performed loose, unscripted sketches for a crowd that mostly wanted to see the strippers, not two long-haired guys talking. Marin has since joked that the hardest part of the job was learning to duck. The audience would occasionally throw things at performers who weren't holding their attention. It was, by his own description, a tough room to learn comedy in, but that pressure forged something real. Chong had recently discovered Chicago's Second City improv scene while touring as a musician, and he pushed the troupe toward instinct-based, unscripted performance rather than written sketches. Marin slid into that style naturally. According to the story the two have told in interviews over the years, they once fell into an improvised bit about a guy trying to track down his friend Dave, with Marin repeating a version of the line, "Dave's not here," until the audience was in stitches. It became one of their signature routines and, eventually, the title of a Grammy-nominated comedy album. Vancouver itself ended up baked into their act in ways audiences may never have realized. Marin's exaggerated accent was partly shaped by performing for Canadian audiences who found Mexican-American characters novel and unfamiliar at the time. Their recurring nemesis in later films, the humorless narcotics cop Sergeant Stadenko, was named after a real Royal Canadian Mounted Police Drug Squad officer Chong remembered from Vancouver. Even Chong's signature drawn-out, "Hey, Mon," was lifted from a hippie named Strawberry who used to hang around the club's lighting booth. When the larger improv troupe eventually dissolved because it wasn't making money, Marin and Chong stayed together and started performing as a duo in other venues, eventually making their way to Los Angeles. What audiences saw on stage? Two men who seemed completely in sync, riffing off each other with effortless timing, masked a much more complicated relationship behind the scenes. Marin has described their bond bluntly over the years, essentially saying the two were more like brothers than best friends, which was less a warm sentiment than an honest acknowledgement of how much friction existed between them. They argued about nearly everything: characters, material, scheduling, and especially creative control and credit. Chong gravitated naturally toward directing and shaping their projects. He ended up directing 4 of their 6 feature films between 1978 and 1984. Marin, who contributed just as much to the writing and comedic rhythm of their work, often felt sidelined by that arrangement, something he later called a genuinely touchy subject between them. None of that tension showed up on stage. They could argue for hours in a dressing room and then walk out and deliver a flawless set that had audiences roaring. Part of what made the partnership so demanding was simply the pace of it. Through the 1970s, Cheech and Chong toured relentlessly, performing well over 200 shows a year at points, writing new material in cars and hotel rooms between stops. The public image of 2 permanently stoned slackers didn't match the reality of a schedule that was closer to a punishing grind, one that left both men, by their own accounts, more exhausted than blissed out. Their creative process only added to the strange contrast between the finished product and how it was actually made. Their 1981 film Nice Dreams, for example, was built from a script that ran barely 3.5 pages, with the rest of the film improvised on the day around a loose set of storyboards. That kind of controlled chaos gave their comedy its loose, alive feeling, but it also meant an enormous amount of the creative direction rested on whoever was steering the ship, which was increasingly Chong. By the mid-1980s, the tension that had always simmered beneath the act reached a breaking point. Marin had begun to feel like a supporting player in a duo he'd helped build from nothing, watching Chong take on more and more control over writing, directing, and shaping their projects. The clearest flashpoint came around 1985. Marin wrote a song called Born in East L.A., a parody of Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, dealing with a Mexican-American man mistakenly deported to Mexico. When it came time to record it, accounts differ slightly on exactly how the falling out happened, but the outcome is well documented. Chong was left feeling insulted by how he was asked to contribute, and the track was recorded without him, even though he still received a songwriting credit on the album. Marin later expanded the song into a film of the same name, which he wrote, directed, and starred in without Chong, and which became a modest commercial hit. That song and the film that followed it marked the real end of the act, at least for the next 2 decades. There was no public blow-up or dramatic falling out captured on camera. Just 2 men who quietly stopped working together after the 1985 album Get Out of My Room, their 9th as a duo. Chong has since reflected on that period with some regret, acknowledging that his desire for control played a real part in pushing Marin away. For Marin, the years after the split meant proving he had range beyond the stoner persona that had made him famous. He built a genuinely substantial solo career, writing, directing, and starring in Born in East L.A., taking supporting roles in Robert Rodriguez films like Desperado and From Dusk Till Dawn, and landing a long-running role as Inspector Joe Dominguez opposite Don Johnson on the crime drama Nash Bridges, which ran from 1996 to 2001. He also became one of the most recognizable voices in American animation, playing Tito in Disney's Oliver and Company, Bonsai the Hyena in The Lion King, and Ramon the Lowrider Car across the Cars trilogy. Off-screen, Marin became a serious and well-known collector of Chicano art, building one of the largest private collections of its kind in the country. Chong's path after the split looked very different. He found mainstream television success, playing the amiable stoner Leo on that 70s show, but his most defining post-Cheech chapter came from something far heavier. In 2003, federal agents targeted Chong as part of a nationwide sting called Operation Pipe Dreams, aimed at companies selling drug paraphernalia across state lines. Chong's son ran a glass pipe business called Nice Dreams Enterprises that used Chong's name and likeness for marketing. Although his son operated the day-to-day business and was never charged, Chong pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute paraphernalia. Of the 55 people charged in the sting, he was the only one sentenced to actual prison time, 9 months in federal custody, plus a $20,000 fine and the forfeiture of roughly $100,000 in assets. Advocacy groups at the time argued he'd effectively been made an example of because of his cultural profile as a symbol of marijuana culture, not because of the severity of what he'd done. He later documented the experience in the film aka Tommy Chong and, years afterward, petitioned for a presidential pardon. Some of the most surprising details about Cheech and Chong live in the margins of their most famous film. When Up in Smoke was finished in 1978, Producer Lou Adler arranged a private screening for his friend Jack Nicholson, who had just been in a car accident and was nursing a dislocated shoulder. Nicholson wasn't supposed to laugh. It hurt every time he did, but according to Adler, he laughed constantly through the screening anyway, letting out pain groans that Adler used almost like a laugh track test audience to judge which jokes were landing. Nicholson's own car, a Volkswagen Beetle, was even borrowed for one of the film's early scenes. The film's now iconic license plate gag has its own strange history too. The Sergeant Stadenko character was named for a real Vancouver drug squad officer Chong remembered from his club days, folding a genuine piece of Canadian law enforcement history into one of the most famous stoner comedies ever made. Decades later, in interviews tied to their 2024 documentary Cheech and Chong's Last Movie, both men reflected candidly on how unlikely their entire story was. Two strangers from completely different backgrounds and different reasons for being in Vancouver, thrown together by a topless bar that needed something to fill the space between dance numbers. Strip away the mythology, and what's left is a genuinely unusual story. A draft dodger and a failed rock guitarist, brought together by a family strip club, who built an act out of instinct rather than scripts and somehow turned it into a cultural institution. Their partnership was never built on easy friendship. By their own description, it was closer to sibling rivalry, full of resentment over credit and control, exhausting tour schedules, and a breakup that came not from one dramatic fight, but from years of accumulated frustration finally boiling over around one song. What makes the story worth revisiting isn't just the trivia. The real Stadenko, the borrowed Nicholson Beetle, the 3.5-page script for an entire feature film. It's that Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong, for all their onstage ease, built something enduring out of genuine conflict and contrast. A disciplined cop's son and a freewheeling nightclub kid, a fugitive and a businessman, colliding by accident in the back room of a strip club and somehow changing American comedy because of it.